Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about how America in 2022 fully, completely, unmitigated, without any exception, has 100% captured fantasy. And fantasy is American now. Let's get that, in my humble opinion, and let me give you all the evidence that allows me to hold that opinion. All right, here we go. So, let's talk about fantasy, right? So, where does it start? I supposition that the first actual fantasy story that mattered was Beowulf. So, I hear you're like, well, wait, what about the Greeks? Well, they told epic tales. They told epic tales that were told really to expound on their gods, right, and their beliefs in gods. And so I don't think the Greeks really did anything in fantasy. They told epic tales. Those epic tales are valuable, less valuable than fantasy, but they're not devoid of value. They're simply just not, everything Homer did and all those kind of things. Those aren't fantasy tales, and they don't have the tropes of fantasy, in my humble opinion. So Beowulf. So when did fantasy start, and who owned it first? Okay. My supposition is that fantasy started with Beowulf, and essentially, and that was England, and England started fantasy, and England birthed fantasy. Okay, there you go. Right, I think that's a fact. Right, yeah. In my humble opinion, England birthed fantasy. I think if you're paying attention and you're looking at narrative, England birthed fantasy. All right, where did it go from there? King Arthur. Major fantasy tale, and that really cemented fantasy, England's ownership of fantasy until Tolkien, right? And at that point, I think fantasy was not really as relevant as it should have been. The King Arthur story, the Beowulf story, these were incredibly, these were earth-shaking, right? And they were really important. They were important from a perspective of they were specifically important from a perspective of an important narrative, right? And they really cemented England's ownership of fantasy, ownership being the most impactful and really where fantasy lived, right? And there were other countries that were telling some stories that were similar, but the reality is the movers and shakers, the greater creators of fantasy lived and came from England. All right? Okay. All right. Let's keep moving here. All right. So, England owns fantasy. And then they absolutely slammed that spike into the ground and made a foundation stone on fantasy with Tolkien. Tolkien completely modernized fantasy and without exception really defined fantasy in the 1950s. Okay? And his work has been preeminent for 70 years. Okay, for 7 decades, England has continued. Until 1974, England continued to own fantasy, and it looked like a resurrection of, and it looked like a revivification of, revivification of England's dominance in and really ownership of fantasy. Okay, all that changed in 1974 with Dungeons and Dragons. So so Gary Gygax comes along and he goes, "I see you, J.R.R. Tolkien. I love your work. I'm going to do you one better." Right? And what Gygax did was he's like, "Okay, all right, nice try, J.R.R. Tolkien. You wrote your story and a bunch of people read it. That sucks, right? I'm going to do it better, right?" And he did. He took every single element that was important to Tolkien's work, right? Dwarves, elves, humans, right? Magic, dragons, everything cool, right? Halflings, right? There you go, right? And then he said, "Your platform sucks," right? He's like, this is antiquated, old, and stupid, right? Why on earth should you just write whatever slop you want and then splat it on some pages, and then I'm supposed to read it and I can't change the story, right? And so he really just declared Tolkien's platform of narrative antiquated, obsolete, and just unneeded anymore, right? So what happened is Gygax comes in and he says, okay, Dungeon Master sets the frame, but no more schmuck readers, right? You don't just sit there and take in what the author said, right? That Dungeon Master is the artist, okay? You are the experiencer. And from 1974, for the rest of humanity, a story told to you like some spoon-fed baby is not enough, right? And he said, the experiencer will change the story with every sentence, every word, second by second. There will be a dance of three things: the artist, the experience, and fate itself. Neither the artist nor the experiencer will have full control of the story. They will be interrupted. They will be redirected. They will be commanded by fate itself, the math rocks, the dice. And Gary Gygax in 1974 set down the new form of human narrative that will exist until all of time, and books will be a footnote to what Gary Gygax accomplished. Right? And he did that, and he said, boom, fantasy belongs to America. There you go. Started in 1974. It was completed in 2022. Tolkien's estate, like, yeah, we get it. Books suck. Gary Gygax showed the true path. But we still need, but we're, J.R.R. Dad's dead. We still living high on the hog. We need some cheddar. Jeff Bezos, we would like to sell fantasy to America. And that's exactly what happened. And that's when the Tolkien estate got out of the business, right, got out of the business of holding the banner of fantasy ownership for England and gave that banner to America, right? But helping along the way to make sure that everybody in the world knows that America, Gary Gygax took it, right? The Tolkien estate sold it, and George R.R. Martin, right, said, just in case y'all thought that we just bought this with a little cheddar, no. Check out Game of Thrones, check out House of Dragon, check out the new fantasy, right? And no spoilers here, but man, if you caught up on House of the Dragon, they dropping it hot, man. That last episode, bye England, y'all suck. We own fantasy, and there is no one in the world that can put anything up that says fantasy is owned by anyone but America. Started in 1974 with Gary Gygax. Jeff Bezos bought the helm of fantasy, put it on the American head, right? And George R.R. Martin clothed all of us and armored us up and gave us the sword of fantasy. America owns fantasy. England is done. Right? D&D, straight to Bezos, straight to George R.R. Martin. America owns fantasy today. That's my humble opinion. I'm ready to hear yours. Do you agree that really fantasy is fully, the crown of fantasy has been surrendered by England and now firmly sits on the head of America? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing. Have a wonderful millennium.